So our next speaker is Ken Bradshaw, who will be talking about the prioritization of restoration actions with multi-scale information, a case study from the Escalante River watershed. So thank you, Ken.
Thanks, Sarah. Just want to start off by saying thanks for inviting me here to give this, and to say that this work is actually work that was mainly done by Utah State University and the BLM National Operations Center. They're kind of the ones that put in the long hours and doing the analysis of this. So those folks are Scott Miller, Kevin Miller from the NOC, Justin Jimenez from the Salt Lake State office, and then Wally McFarland, Christian Perry, Brian Lobb, all from Utah State, and Sam Litchert, also from NOC. So I just wanted to give them credit for me giving their work. So just like AIM is a kind of a landscape approach to assessment, inventory, and monitoring, the BLM also has rapid ecoregional assessments all across the West that are also kind of a product of this evolution towards landscape and resource management. And so these RIAs integrate available scientific information mostly through GIS. They weren't initially set up to be data collection. They were mostly to look at what data we already have and how to integrate that data into sort of resource conditions or intactness. So they looked at all kinds of different resources, different areas of wildlife, terrestrial intactness and aquatic intactness. And they're really looking at how the status, how those resources change due to human activities and how intact they are. And so what they really do is they identify these areas of high versus low intactness in the ecoregions. So these were done, the initial one for the Colorado Plateau was done in 2012, and in 2014, I think the Utah State Office, along with the NOC, kind of identified that the aquatic intactness models weren't quite where they wanted them to be. So they kind of stepped into this and sort of did the aquatic intactness modeling for both the Colorado Plateau and other parts of Utah that fall outside of that. And so what they were looking to do is identify landscape stressors in the Utah-Colorado watershed or area, and identify areas of low and high intactness. So for the way this works is high intactness means there's a low impact. So if you look at the map here, the greens scaled down, the blues go from very high intactness or very low impacts to very low intactness or very high impacts in terms of the aquatic resource. And these are based on the amount of disrupted hydrology, water quality, and aquatic habitat quality in these watersheds. And I'll talk a little more about that, how that works. So the project question for us was, how can we integrate these sort of landscape approaches together to come up with some management decision tools? And so what we're looking at here is both the aquatic, or the RIA, or taking the RIA data from the Colorado Plateau and stepping it down into a smaller watershed like the Escalante River watershed. And this watershed's kind of neat because it falls across management boundaries. So in the northern part, we have the Forest Service. In the middle part, we have the Bureau of Land Management. And then the lower part, it's the Park Service managing it with Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. So we're really trying to see how well are we managing things and identify areas where we can implement projects for conservation and or restoration. So to step this down into the Escalante River watershed, we're really looking at what are the areas of high and low intactness within that watershed. So again, we're scaling this from green as very high to blue as very low. And so you already see there's some definite areas that stand out. And this is right around the town of Escalante. And so these are more impacted areas. But I guess the question was why? What's causing that? And kind of the manager's questions for us is how can we show resource specialists how to dig into this data? And that's really what we were asking Utah State to kind of help us out and show us to make this RIA data useful. And so just some management questions that come out of this are what stressors are impacting the scores, and what things do land management agencies or managers have control over. So this is a really complicated looking slide, and I don't want to go through all of it, but this is just kind of showing you how aquatic intactness is modeled. And so what this model is called a fuzzy logic model. So it's taking data on the very low end, and these are all GIS data, and they're all in different units of measure. So for example, domestic water use might be in, acre feet or millions of gallons a day, whereas some land cover data is going to be in percent land cover. So what a fuzzy logic model does is sort of puts those on a scale where they can all be compared and used to rate or index the landscape. And so for aquatic intactness, there's really three main areas that drive aquatic intactness scores, and these are hydrologic alterations, water quality, and habitat quality. And each of these three things have a model sort of driving it that looks something like this, with the data coming from all different GIS sources. So what Utah State did initially was to dig into this data and see what drives those scores. And so sort of the way that model is looking at aquatic intactness is it's taking the average of the lowest of the two of those three components that I talked about. And so what they found out was that there's kind of three combinations that drive intactness scores in the watershed. So this is habitat quality and hydrologic alteration, habitat quality and water quality, and hydrologic alterations and water quality. So, and this is kind of how they're distributed among the watershed in these groups. And you can see in different areas and different sub-watersheds what kind of is driving those scores. So then to take it a step further, they looked at what's essentially driving the hydrologic alterations within the watershed, and they kind of mapped this out. And so on this scale, the lighter shades are the less intact areas, the darker shades are the more intact areas. And so we're looking at impervious surface as a hydrologic alteration, water demand, and water control. And so just to give kind of an example of an area that you would expect more impervious surface would be around the town of Escalante, as well as water demand around Escalante, because that's kind of the agricultural area within the watershed where the town of Escalante is located, with paved streets and buildings and such, as well as agricultural water withdrawals. So then we wanted to bring AIM into this to sort of see if we could use AIM data and this RIA data together to get at what's causing some of the aquatic intactness scores, both high and low in the area. And so for the AIM data, we did a target population within the Escalante watershed in the Grand Staircase, and a spatially balanced random sampling, which allows us to infer around stream miles around those points to get at sort of the proportion of the watershed that contributes to each of the indicators in the aquatic AIM. So the objectives of that were of the AIM study was to determine the extent of uplands and streams with minimal, moderate, or significant departure from reference condition, also to identify biologically relevant stressors, and then look at what may be driving the land use changes and what those stressors are. So this graph is sort of related to that spatially balanced sample design. So we were able to look at all the indicators that were measured in AIM and summarize those as a proportion of stream kilometers impacted. So in the graph on the left, some of the dominant indicators here that we see, I guess, in poor conditions in the watershed are in-stream habitat complexity, excessive specific conductivity, which is related to salinity, bank conditions, macroinvertebrate conditions. Sorry, I can't read this side. And so that AIM data has kind of given us an idea of what what areas in the watershed we need to be focusing on. And then what they did, or what Utah State did, was to predict, for biological relevance, to predict what macroinvertebrate scores are in the watershed using the other indicator values. And they did this using a multivariate non-parametric method that's a little more robust and doesn't have quite the assumptions about normality and things like that in the data. And so things that are driving sort of biologically relevant in terms of macroinvertebrate conditions are excess nitrogen, the in-stream habitat complexity, and bank incision. And so these are the parameters that if you take these out of the model prediction, score goes down. So they're important for modeling that condition. So then another area we wanted to look at is what specific aim points are telling us. So for this example, we have just the salinity scores in the 21 aim points. And one thing that you notice is there's a lot of red here. And so the red points are indicating poor salinity values, and this is poor salinity beyond what would be expected, so beyond the natural variability in the system. And so we see here that there's kind of a vast geographic extent of poor salinity conditions in the watershed, and it suggests that the salinity might be a problem here. And so to kind of marry the AIM data and the RIA data together, we did more of this random forest modeling where we took our sampled sites from AIM, our Escalante River watershed, and then using the input data from the RIA, so that bottom level of data as the disturbance metrics or the independent variables to try and predict specific conductance, again, using this non-parametric multivariate random forest model. And so what we see from that are another kind of graph of variable importance from those RIA points. And so the top one on the list was oil and gas wells, which was kind of interesting because the data shows that there's a good number of oil and gas wells within the watershed. And as we presented this to the meeting, or to the group, the partnership group in the BLM and Escalante, somebody raised their hand and said, wait a minute, we don't have that many oil and gas wells, so is this right? And I think there's only 5 active oil and gas wells. So I guess what I'm getting at here is the local knowledge in the watershed in the area is also very important, because this is just taking sort of integrating AIM and geographic data to say what might be causing the intactness scores, or in this case, the conductivity problems. So just some other important variables for salinity was, or drivers of salinity scores, was riparian invasives, number of dams and hydrologic alterations, road densities and percent pastures, and then urban, or I guess different types of land cover. And so we, just to kind of give like a couple of examples of how management might use this type of data, we have two examples here. One is Calf Creek, which is a moderately high intact watershed. And we look at both the RIA data and the macroinvertebrate intactness scores, and we say, hey, this watershed isn't really in that bad of condition, so we could maybe look at this as more of a conservation or restoration type watershed of maybe like native activities like native fish. In the second example, we have the town of Escalante, which I showed had the low intactness scores. They had low biologic integrity and poor salinity scores, as you see here by the red dots. And so maybe this area, because of these conditions, might be something that we would look at for more, management direction or restoration to try to bring those scores back into place. So the outcomes of this were that we had, in addition to sort of the data-driven part of this, local knowledge is really important for kind of understanding what's going on the ground and understanding what the data is telling us. And then as part of this project, we really want to get this so that we don't have to have Utah State or the NOC do this type of analysis to get the resource specialists engaged and sort of understand how they can dive into this data. And so there's going to be some, decision support tools coming out from this to sort of help field offices to kind of dig into this data and to help them design projects around it. So with the RIA data, I guess there's two kind of things with RIA and AIM, is they're both sort of important on their own, and they both are spatially limited, I guess. So with the RIA data, you're kind of limited to those sub-watersheds, and in the AIM data, you get a little more information, but by marrying those two things together, we felt like we understood what was going on in the watershed a little better. And then, we hope these can be used to help managers and resource specialists make better decisions. So moving forward, I think we're going to look into more of those AIM conditions like in-stream habitat complexity, bank condition, total nitrogen, and do more of that kind of causal modeling with the grain of forest to try to figure out what might be areas that we could implement projects to improve the watershed conditions. Okay, I'm almost done. And then, again, identify specific sub-watersheds there that we can implement projects. And just to point out, our disturbance layers were that RIA data, but we also did some riparian condition modeling along with USU did it, sorry, too many acronyms. And so that looks at sort of what the riparian vegetation condition is, and that might be an important input data set for these types of analysis. But at the end of the day, this project, and it's still ongoing, we're still learning a lot along the way, but it's demonstrating the integration of the multi-scale information from both RIA and AIM to inform management decisions. So just to acknowledge again, the USU Watershed Sciences, the Ecogeomorphology and Topographic Labs, the NOC, and the National Aquatic Monitoring Center for all of the work they did. I'll attempt to answer questions. I might have to rely on Scott a little bit.
Good presentation. I was curious as to gas wells, how you do that data? Was it like number of wells per sub-hub, or?
I think it was density, number of wells per square kilometer, I think is what it was. And so basically, if you looked at the individual variable importance, like once you increase beyond like 1 or 2 wells, the variable importance just goes sky high and stays that way. And in the data layer, only 5 were active, and I think there were multiple, dozens of wells. But just we know what the oil and gas area is in the watershed, and so the data layer was showing wells that were drilled and probably drilled for exploratory purposes, but there was only 5 active ones. But then I think Scott also found a paper that USGS had put out that talked more about the disturbance of, the pads and the roads being more maybe a source of salinity because of disturbing those saline soils, and then you start to get those in the watershed. So it might not necessarily be the direct impact from the well itself, but indirect from the infrastructure that goes on.
All right, thanks, Ken.
Thank you.